We've looked at the journalistic media, the internet, and big tech, and now we're going to draw our focus to academia. I've thought much about, there was a piece in New York Magazine back in 2018 by, where's Howard? Who do you have speaking this weekend? Andrew Sullivan. So it was Andrew Sullivan's piece, the title of which was "We All Live on Campus Now." And that was 4 years ago, and many of the debates and discussions around free speech, Lacey was saying before, as a Berkeley grad, that was at one time the home of what was called the free speech movement. And it's fair to say that many of the challenges that we're seeing around free speech are originating on our college campuses. Is this true? We will investigate that in this panel, moderated by my friend Gail Harriet, who is a professor of law at the University of San Diego, who will introduce our panelists. Please welcome up Professor Harriet.
Now, first, on behalf of the panel, I would like to thank Pete and to thank Pepperdine School of Public Policy, to thank the Fieldstead Company and the Amundsen family for this wonderful conference. So let me get started here. This panel is asking the question, is academia the root of our problems here? I mean, put differently, did the seeds of the decline in appreciation for free expression and all the things that seem to be going with that, did that get started on college campuses and spread across the country to American large corporations, to K through 12, through even professional sports now? Is that how it happened? You know, our colleges are staffed overwhelmingly with progressives. Have they persuaded students of their ideas, alas, including what I would call a lack of respect for the free exchange of ideas, and have students in turn gone out into the world and implemented those ideas? I mean, if so, if that's how it happened, then we need to solve the problem on campuses in order to solve it elsewhere. And one question we got to deal with is, how are we going to do that? How are we going to do that? It's not going to be easy. And for that matter, even if the campus problem is really not the root cause of the decline in free speech more generally, how are we going to solve the problems on campuses specifically? It doesn't have to be the root cause in order to be a problem in and of itself. Of course, something has to be behind the anti-free speech movement that seems to be sweeping the country. It doesn't have to be one thing, but if it's not campus culture, then what is it? I actually have some of my own ideas on that we might get into a little bit later in the hour. But right now, let me just say that I think there is a broad problem. And one little bit of evidence that I'd like to present is a Cato Institute survey in the year 2020, which found that self-censorship is on the rise in the United States. 62% of Americans, this isn't just students, but 62% of Americans say that the political climate these days prevents them from saying things that they believe because they're afraid that others would find them offensive. That's a significant increase since even 2017, which wasn't all that long ago, when it was 58% of Americans who agreed with that statement. And it's not just Republicans. It's true that Republicans self-censor a little bit more, 77% of them, but 52% of Democrats said that they self-censor, and 59% of independents. And I assume if you've been keeping track of this over the last, not just few years, but last 3 decades or so, you'll remember that hate speech codes basically started on campuses. With a very, very expansive definition of what constitutes hate speech. So they've been around on campuses for a long time, since the 1980s. And think about how strange that is. colleges and universities as institutions, they're the ones that are supposed to be the places where the free exchange of ideas is especially valued. And for the last 35 years, it's been more the opposite and getting worse. My own students have told me that they fear speaking up, not just because they fear being canceled by their fellow students and by the university, but by potential employers. The Knight Foundation asked college students whether their college environment prevented them from speaking freely out of fear that they would offend. They got 65% of students saying yes to that. Again, up significantly from previous years. So we have 3 excellent speakers to discuss all of this today. Brad Wilcox, for example, in the center there, is a professor of sociology at the University of Virginia and director of the National Marriage Project there at the University of Virginia. He's also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and a senior fellow at the Institute for Family Studies. John Shields, down at the end, is a professor of government at Claremont McKenna College, where he likes to teach courses that are on especially uncontroversial issues like policing, free speech, and the culture wars. You're a brave man, John. His most recent book is Trump's Democrats, co-authored with Stephanie Moravchik. He's also the co-author of Passing on the Right, Conservative Professors in the Progressive University. Cassie Dillon, right here next to me, is a political strategist, commentator, and director of digital engagement at Ambassador Nikki Haley's Stand for America, while attending college at a school that isn't exactly known for being conservative, and I will leave it to Cassie whether she wants to identify her undergraduate institution. She founded Lone Conservative, a group that has given over 500 conservative students a voice and media experience. And this point is very important here, given where we are sitting right now, she is a recent graduate of this very school, Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. So let me start with Brad here. You're at Mr. Jefferson's University, for goodness sake. If any state university should be dedicated to the free exchange of ideas, it ought to be UVA. So what has been your experience there and the experience of your colleagues? Has the free exchange of ideas really been consistently respected, as I suspect Mr. Jefferson would have wanted? And if not, what's being done to recreate that culture?
Yeah, thanks, Gail. What I've seen at UVA is variously dispiriting and now a little bit more encouraging. So in 2018, on the more kind of discouraging side of the ledger, what happened was that a medical student was at a panel kind of much like the one we're at today. And there was a kind of a discussion of microaggression theory that's being led by one of the deans at UVA. And this medical student started raising questions, critical questions that were kind of aimed at this dean. And for his sins was given what's called a professional card by one of the med school professors. And I guess the pattern there is that they're trying to encourage the med students to kind of gain certain virtues and skills and orientations. And sort of the very act of kind of questioning this particular doctrine was deemed to be unprofessional. And so then he was kind of like called into a meeting with the dean of students in the medical school, and that led to some kind of committee that met with him, and he did not respond well to this kind of Kafkaesque discipline. I don't know all of sort of the particulars in terms of what transpired between him and the dean and then this committee, but again, for his sins, he was kind of kicked out of med school and forbidden from setting foot on the grounds of Mr. Jefferson's University. And again, this all kind of began because he raised some critical questions, and that you can listen to the audio on the internet. I think very intelligent questions. So this is kind of, in some ways, I think, the sort of the nadir of free speech at UVA. And both this incident and other kinds of incidents on ground sort of generated conservative alumni concern. And there was a lot of pressure, I think, put on the administration on this issue. And partly, I think, for that reason, they actually convened and issued a statement related to free speech and academic freedom in 2021. articulating and kind of commitment to free speech and academic freedom that was encouraging. And then this spring, we saw the new governor of Virginia come, Glenn Youngkin, and kind of give a big speech on free speech. And we saw at the same time the student newspaper, the Cavalier Daily, express concern about kind of being unsafe because Vice President Mike Pence was invited to give a major address at UVA. And that in turn generated a lot of commentary from alumni, and then 17 faculty members, including myself, issued a letter kind of basically encouraging UVA to welcome Vice President Pence and kind of to embrace the spirit of free expression on grounds. So in the wake of these kinds of developments, both the university's public commitment in 2021 and then faculty standing up for free speech this year, and then also Governor Youngkin's sort of arrival on grounds to give a speech in favor of academic freedom, these dynamics, I think, have pushed UVA in a more constructive direction, where I think faculty and students and alumni feel like there's a greater willingness to sort of allow for a range of voices on ground. So that's sort of the encouraging story here. And I think the takeaway is that we need to be thinking about ways in which conservative alumni can found groups that are pressuring their own universities. We can think about how public officials can kind of make it very clear that they're supportive of free speech in their public institutions. And then also encourage those faculty members who are either conservative or kind of liberal-minded in the broadest sense to be more articulate in standing up for free speech. And when those kinds of things happen, I think we can sort of send some signals to the university communities that free speech is valued. Of course, the final thing that I would say is that all of this depends, though, on one virtue that's in short supply on college campuses, and that virtue, of course, is courage. And so we do need to see, I think, faculty and students exercising more courage, recognizing that they're often going to pay some kind of social price, either in the faculty lounge or in some of their contexts on Twitter, for instance, by standing up for free speech and a range of perspectives on our university campuses.
Speaking of courage, I think Cassie has actually shown some courage in her undergraduate career. You've had a very different experience, I think, as an undergraduate, and then here at the School of Public Policy, and your founding of the Lone Conservative. Tell us a little about that.
I have so many stories about craziness that I dealt with at my undergrad, and I have no problem shaming them. Mount Holyoke College, it is an all-women's college in Western Massachusetts. Complete intellectual diversity bastion. They love free speech there. I'm only kidding. I tried to invite Ben Shapiro, and they held an emergency meeting titled, "What is Free Speech?" And they didn't invite me to this meeting, even though it was me inviting Ben. And they had 3 professors speak. 2 of them were not lawyers, were like in the humanities. One was like an art professor, like nothing to do with free speech. And then they had a constitutional law professor show up. And he's a liberal, and he's a dear friend of mine. Even before this, I still keep in touch with him. He has since retired because he can't deal with the craziness anymore. But he got on the stage and he said, free speech is free speech, and that's what free speech is. Hate speech is free speech. And people were up in arms. People were freaking out. They're shouting him down. They were making noises and just being completely obnoxious. Now, we didn't end up hosting Ben, but I did get involved into student journalism through my time at Mount Holyoke. And on my first assignment, I was assigned to a school next to mine, UMass Amherst. It's a very large school. And this was 2016 in May, or it could be the end of April. It was the end of April. And they had 3 speakers on campus. And I show up. I have no idea who any of these speakers are. A lot of them are pretty big now. One of them was Steven Crowder. And so I show up, and people are losing their minds. And this was my first time seeing campus protests. I was a sophomore, didn't really go to these types of events. And there was this one student who was completely going bananas behind me, like flailing her arms, screaming, "Get your hate speech off of my campus," like completely losing it. And all I did was I took a video of her. And I didn't think it was a big deal. Like, I knew everyone was going crazy, but I didn't realize that a lot of people hadn't seen what these protests looked like at the time. So we published it, and it went completely viral. It was one of the biggest memes of 2016. The internet calls her Trigglypuff. I did not name her that. You can Google it. You can watch this video. It's crazy. And through that, I really got involved in student journalism. And through this, we encountered so many different crazy things happening on campus. Another school neighboring mine, Hampshire College, that is a unique school. They don't have grades. It's a very, very hippie school. They banned the American flag on Veterans Day, right after the election. And that got them a lot of press attention. President Trump tweeted about it at the time because everyone knew this was crazy. And what happened was something really remarkable, and I think it should serve as an inspiration for how we can actually fight back against this. There was about a group of, I'd say 200 to 300 veterans who showed up at the campus with flags, and they just stood outside and tried to talk to students. And luckily, a couple days later, they reinstated the American flag and allowed it back on campus. So that was a really good one. But I want to give a little shout out to SPP because I graduated last year, and I really enjoyed my time here. When I founded Lone Conservative at Mount Holyoke, I did it because I really was the only one. We had the college Republicans, and there was a libertarian and a girl who wasn't conservative, she was just pro-life, and then me. 3 members for like about 3 years. We got somewhere my senior year, but it was pretty bad. But when I came to SPP, in one of my first classes, Professor Shires asked all of us with our little clickers, so you can answer anonymously, asked us who we voted for in 2016. 47% of students said Hillary Clinton, 29% said Donald Trump, 6% said Gary Johnson, and 18% said other. If you would have asked that at Mount Holyoke, and if I would have said President Trump, people would have been hunting down to figure out who was the one who voted for President Trump. We also asked our political ideology, and I do not think you will see this in any other classroom in America. Maybe Claremont. Claremont's ranked #1 in free speech in America. But 6% of the students are communist socialist, 28% were Democrat, 22% Republican, 11% libertarian, 11% progressive, and 22% other. Every American classroom should look like that. When I was at Mount Holyoke, my professors, actually, most of them really enjoyed having me in the class because class is boring when everyone agrees with each other, and they would force me to speak up. But at SPP, I didn't have to be the only one speaking up. Now, there was a time where I had a sparring partner in some of my classes, a very left-wing student, but we were really good friends, and we would have the dialogue back and forth, and it never got too hostile. People enjoyed that. I did not have that experience at Mount Holyoke. My students would cry after class if they thought I was too... I literally said that I don't believe in Medicare for all, and a student started crying in class, and I got talked to by my professor, to be a little nicer. And one final point. After I recorded that viral video of that student at UMass Amherst, I got an email from my dean 2 days later saying I was required, this was during finals, I was required to go to the dean's office because there was a serious concern about me not protecting other people's privacy rights. So I freak out, I'm 19 years old, and I asked that constitutional law professor to come with me because I'm scared. And so I walk in, he sits down, he tells him I will be representing Miss Dillon today. And the dean was terrified. He has the standing court case in the state of Massachusetts for free speech back in the 80s when people actually liked free speech. And he sat down as a liberal professor who can't believe what happened to the school, and he defended me. They were seriously considering getting me in trouble, even though I wrote an article and took a video of a student at a different college, and that student also went to a different college, and I was getting called into my dean's office during finals for that. So that's the state of colleges right now. I don't have much hope. Maybe I'll share some hope I have later, but that's my experience.
Thank you. Now, maybe John will be more hopeful. John, you've written a book, Passing on the Right, which tells the story of conservative professors at progressive universities. We've all heard stories about cancellation, not just of conservatives, but of various academics. How does a conservative or non-conforming, shall we say, professor, how do they deal with the modern university?
Thanks, Gail, for the good question. Actually, I've been thinking about that book recently, and the book I co-authored with Josh Dunn, and when we did field work for it way back, 10 years ago now, and we interviewed tons of conservative and libertarian professors, over 150 of them, and actually not one of them mentioned free speech as a problem on university campuses, right? And it suggests how, so none of us saw this coming, right? And it suggests really how quick and sudden I think the culture on campuses changed. Now, since I've written that book, I have thought a lot about this question, mostly because I teach at a small undergraduate college. I teach courses that are on hot topics, as Gail mentioned. So I teach courses on everything from the culture wars to policing, to race, to a course on free speech. And so I'm concerned about self-censorship on campus. It's true, as Casey mentioned, our college ranks very well, at least according to FIRE, but only comparatively. Actually, if you really dig into that data, right, we're sort of like a C minus, right? Like if you really dig into the data, right, it suggests that there's a lot of student anxiety. It's very domain specific. I mean, I think that's true, right? It's on particular issues, so it's not a generalizable anxiety. So a lot of my thinking about this is informed really by experience, right? Just by teaching this generation and teaching sort of difficult topics. And that experience leaves me, in some ways, sort of a little disenchanted with some of the defenses of free speech. So I'll just sort of mention, give you sort of a little flavor for this, right? So there's a lot of emphasis on freedom, right, as the fundamental good at stake. And as Robbie suggested in his talk earlier today, freedom's not the main end of the university, actually, right? It's truth-seeking, it's the dissemination of knowledge. Freedom tends to be an important instrumental good if you're trying to, seek the truth, right? But it's not the ultimate end. And in fact, if we really want to pursue the truth, we also need to regulate speech in some ways, right? Like we need a culture that has norms that helps direct and guide us and lead us to the truth, right? So I'll give you a concrete example. So this is the summer George Floyd was murdered. I, in my, lacking better judgment, thought, well, I'll teach a course on policing in the fall, right? This is the right time to do this. And on the first day of class, I had students on the one hand who were really, right, they really wanted to talk about policing, and they were also a little terrified, right? Because they thought, gee, this could be dangerous. And so on the first day of class, I had a student who said, gee, can we make it a rule that anything we say in class doesn't then spill out into social media land? And I said, sure, let's make it a rule, right? Let's make it sort of like the Vegas rule, right? Like what happens in Gov 137B stays in Gov 137B. Now notice, I am asking them to kind of keep quiet though, right? I mean, I'm asking them to be discreet, to not then leave the classroom and blab to their friends or on social media about what some crazy thing, right, some fellow student said, right? So in other words, right, these students wanted a safe space, right? They're anxious, they're nervous, they want to be able to, right, they need to be in a community where they can really trust people. And that, again, that requires norms. So in some ways, I dislike the way that, safetyism gets contrasted with freedom, right? I think that's kind of actually the wrong construct, right? I think in a way, I want to defend, right, my own version of free speech, of safe spaces, right? Like real freedom and open inquiry requires not just courage, as Brad suggests, but sort of a trust, right? And trust is built through a community that has some shared norms. So in some ways, I'm sort of, I think freedom isn't quite the right frame, right? Instead, I would say somehow, at least in the university, we need a kind of culture of open inquiry that regulates speech in ways that advance the pursuit of truth. Along these same lines, again, teaching these same kinds of courses. I mean, if you just read John Stuart Mill or the, Chicago Statement of Principles or some rationalist sort of, liberal document like this, there's a lot of emphasis just on reason. But of course, we encounter students students aren't just creatures with rational minds, right? They're also social creatures, right? And they have lots of sub-rational sentiments, anxieties, fears. And I think as a practical matter, teachers have to think about, okay, how do you actually open people's minds, right? How does that actually work? And sometimes that means playing to identity politics in certain ways, right? So when I teach conservatives, if I teach, you know, if I teach an anti-feminist, the sort of, I want to assign a female, right? Like, of course I do, because I don't want to, right? Because we're social creatures and we're inclined to trust people, you know, if they share certain demographic characteristics, or, right? So my female students are like, well, okay, she's a woman, like maybe, right? Maybe I should listen to her. I can't dismiss this person as just a sexist male, right? Or I even taught a whole course on race in which I just taught Black authors, right? But I taught a full spectrum. I taught Jason Riley on the one hand, right? I taught some conservatives. I taught some lefties like Ta-Nehisi Coates. I taught lots of heterodox people in the middle. And again, then we could just have a conversation about the ideas, right? And students, again, weren't inclined to think, well, gee, I can't really trust this person because, right, they're from some other social group. They don't really get or understand sort of the Black experience. Incidentally, I learned this lesson first, not teaching lefties, but teaching religious conservatives. When I first taught a course on evangelicals, I taught a book by Mark Noll, who's you know, evangelical, taught at Wheaton for years, now is at Notre Dame, I think. I taught a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, which is a sort of his critique of anti-intellectualism in sort of the evangelical tradition. And I had a lot of evangelical students in that class. And they were willing to listen to Mark Noll, again, because he was an evangelical, right? Subnotice, oh, this guy's at Wheaton College, right? Right, so then they were really open to open their minds and take those ideas seriously. So of course we should take the identities of lots of authors into account when we're teaching these kinds of courses, right? Again, if we really want to open students' minds. The last thing I would say, very quickly, is that I also think there's a certain kind of, you know, sometimes the free speech problem, it's serious on the one hand, but it also, my concern is that it sort of gets catastrophized and sort of overstated. You know, when I think about, you know, there's like 6,000 political scientists in this country. I think most of them probably are doing a pretty good job, right? Well, some of them might be bad professors, but they're not fundamentally illiberal, and they don't, right, they're not interested in, right, they're not deeply ideological. I know the records is going to be more mixed in a field like sociology, but I actually think there's a lot of, right, there's a lot of great teaching happening, even in this context. I think it's important not to lose sight of that. And by way of analogy, right, I'd say it's a little bit like, in some ways different, but it's a little bit like, you know, the policing conflict, right? Like, yes, there's some very bad cops out there, right? But there's also, right, really excellent ones, and mostly they're really quite good. And most of the, you know, it's still the case today, I think, that in the university is still a place where lots of great conversations happen every day. Right? That's the institution that it happens in. So I would resist I mean, sometimes I hear this from the right, and I myself am a conservative, but sometimes I hear it from my conservative friends. There's a tendency to think, well, we should just raise the university, you burn it to the ground, it's irredeemable. You hear this a little bit from, I think, in Heather MacDonald's most recent book. And to me, that has sort of echoes the 1960s, the late 60s. And I think we conservatives should resist that, right? If conservatives aren't defending you know, sort of America's institutions, right? We can't really do the work we're supposed to do in American society. So I think we should take a more measured view of this problem and not overstate it.
John, you said something that struck me there, that you had interviewed conservatives, and I didn't catch what year you were talking about.
So this was 2003, so it's 10 years ago.
Yeah, but you know, I was going through my mind.
I'm sorry, 2013.
Yeah,
sorry.
I was going through my mind.
Yeah.
We have a fair number of conservatives at my law school.
Yeah.
And anybody who considered themselves a conservative would continue to tell you that, you know, till the bitter end, that they're not deterred, because they're not really.
Right.
It's the ones that don't come out and say, I'm a conservative, who have somewhat middle of the road, or might even be conservative, but don't want, would never have agreed to be interviewed by your book.
I'm sure if Josh and I reran the study and interviewed all the same folks we did today and asked them about the free speech climate problem, it would all be at the top of the list, right? They would all say.
But even in the 1990s, I have colleagues, you know, we teach law, criminal law professors who are basically middle of the road, telling me I don't teach rape anymore because it's just too dangerous. And the idea of like not teaching rape in a criminal law class, that's a significant crime, and it has issues that are unique to rape. But and it's not the conservative professors, at least not the ones who are openly conservative. It's the ones who are middle of the road, or even left of center, left of center, or conservative but don't want anybody to know. So I'd be curious about what would have, if we could go back in time and grab some of those and see what they would have said. But let me throw out a question to all three of you. And that is, I think, an important aspect of this is, did the current situation that we see in American corporations, at the K through 12 level, in professional sports, in the media, is this leakage from campus? Is it true that, we all live on campus now? Is this where it got started? Or are there more root causes or multiple causes? Who wants to grab that one? Cassie?
So I disagree. I do think that we didn't overstate the problem going on campus enough. And that's why we're seeing what we are seeing today in corporate America, especially. When I was writing in 2016, it was a story that a school had a free speech zone. It was a story that there was a safe space. It was a story that words were labeled trigger words. Those were all stories. It was a story that you had critical race training and things like that. Like that was worth writing about. Now it's happening in every college in America, and it's not a story anymore. And now it's happening in almost every single corporation, sports teams, the military. It's happening in all facets of American life. So I think we didn't blow it up enough. I think we didn't talk about how insane a lot of this is.
So yeah, I mean, I think obviously there's a kind of Burkean kind of obviously story or narrative you're advancing, John, and I appreciate the Burkean character of your remarks. At the same time, though, I think you have to acknowledge and appreciate how radically sort of off our universities are, and what a pernicious influence they're having on many different aspects of American life. And so my area, of course, is family. And what we're seeing, in our culture today is record low marriage rates, record low fertility rates. We're also seeing this incredible marriage divide in American life, where college-educated Americans are getting and staying married, and everyone else is not. And what's striking is we did actually a survey and report on California with the support of the Amundsons, for which I'm grateful. And in that report, we did a survey of California residents and found that college-educated Californians were big supporters of family diversity as a kind of public ethic. Okay, but then we asked them, what's your own personal plan for how you're going to start a family? And once you turn to that question, the vast majority of them planned on having their kids in marriage, and we also looked at their demographics, and the vast majority of them were stably married with kids. So what's happening in the US and also in the Golden State is that our college-educated elites talk left, for instance, on family issues, but walk right, okay? And so the problem with that, besides just the fact that it's hypocritical, is that they're not supporting, as Silicon Valley titans, as Hollywood showrunners, as school superintendents throughout the state here of California, they're not supporting the values and the virtues that sustain strong and stable families, in their own communities and sort of at the heights of the culture that they occupy. And instead, they're kind of advancing ideas and notions and vices that are extremely corrosive of American family life. So I think we have to think about the ways in which both colleges and universities are exercising, a kind of pernicious role in our public culture, and to think about ways to reform them to address this. And so free speech here, I think, comes back in terms of, we have to sort of basically get more public speakers from Ben Shapiro, or Caitlin Flanagan, who are more sensible on these things to kind of give an alternative voice on college campuses on these questions. And we also need to think about creating new institutions, supporting institutions like Pepperdine as well. But also in our public universities, it's far past time for governors and state legislators in more right-leaning states to inject needed intellectual and ideological diversity on things like the family and on many other topics and issues, so that our students have access to ideas that are not only kind of intellectually more diverse, but more importantly, ideas that are true about the nature of, in this case, family. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done on both the free speech front, but also on kind of like promoting, diversity, authentic intellectual diversity on college campuses, particularly in states where, there are opportunities to start new centers and new colleges in our public universities.
Can I just add something real quick? I think it's really hard to defend American institutions when people just don't trust them anymore. And I think one of the reasons for that is they don't deserve our trust or our defense. And an example of this is we're leaving it up to 18 to 21-year-olds right now to bring different viewpoints to colleges. Many of these colleges only have conservative speakers when a student organization, when an 18-year-old brings them there. And that is so unacceptable that you are relying on YAF and TPUSA and LI and all these other organizations to bring viewpoint diversity and enrich these schools because they won't do it themselves. And I just want to give one really interesting example of a way that an 18-year-old, 19-year-old college student pushed back. At UMass Amherst, they had a free speech zone, which are very unique. The rule was between, and any lawyers in the room, correct me if I'm wrong about this, the rule was between 12 and 1 p.m., you were allowed to have whatever posters, say whatever you want within a 20 by 20 square in front of the quad. Other than that, you needed about a week's notice to simply hold a sign, have a table, hand out flyers at a public university. And so this group of students got together and they started doing kind of satirical humor to test the free speech zone. The first thing they did was they held a vigil for Harambe, the monkey that was killed, or the gorilla, and they handed out flyers doing something satirical to test the school. And so they kept doing this for over a year, and eventually they were able to sue the school and get this repealed. The fact that young college students had to correct that university's wrong policy is absurd. And if these institutions want to deserve trust and defense from Americans, then they need to start correcting and not relying on kids to do it for them.
So, all right. So, in response to Gail's question about the root of the problem, I mean, I think the best case that the university really is the root of the problem is a book called Cynical Theories, which some of you are probably familiar with, written by Pluckrose and Lindsay. And they sort of tell this story that begins with postmodernism in the 1960s, and then it sort of evolves and metastasizes and gets more applied into particular fields. You get, post-colonialism and queer theory, et cetera, as well as sort of a lot of the, the current theories that are being used now to coerce and restrict speech. So, theories like intersectionality and standpoint epistemology, et cetera. And I think it's very well done. It's a great book. It's a really good genealogy of postmodernism, and it's a really good intellectual history. But I'm skeptical that that story really tells us a whole lot about our current moment, or at the very least, I think it's a partial explanation. Partly because I just don't think most American history is downstream from French political philosophy, right? That just sort of strikes me as probably unlikely. It strikes me that a lot of wokeism seems familiar to me. I mean, I'm a student of the American right, and to me, it looks much more like a sort of secular populist revival. It's got a certain leftist flavoring to it, but to me, it looks much more American than it does French. And so I'll sort of flesh this out a little bit more. I mean, one, there's a kind of deep cynicism toward those in power, right? It's very populist in that way. There's a sense that society is organized to really serve the interest of the powerful. Wokeism shares with a lot of the populist right a kind of skepticism toward organized science. Lived experience, right? This idea that everyday experience sort of imparts some really important kind of knowledge that you can't get through credentials or formal learning. You see this in a lot of American revivals, right? You see this in the tradition of American revival Protestantism, right? Which said, no, we know the truth. We know God is real because we've experienced God. We don't need to listen to these, learned, educated theologians. What do they know, right? We have lived experience. Even the idea of equity, I'm working on a book on Wyoming politics, as I'm interested in Liz Cheney and her feud with Donald Trump. Equity is this idea that something's wrong with institutions, even ones that formally seem fair on the surface, if it unfairly advantages some groups and not others. You see this very much in Wyoming. Rural counties want more power in the state party and the legislature, and they want rules that give them more power above and beyond what their numbers should give them. There was a long tradition of this, actually, in the American politics before Reynolds v. Sims and court cases in the 60s that demanded the sort of one person, one vote rule. You had lots of rural counties that said, no, we can't compete with urban interest if we're going to move to a one person, one vote model. If we're going to protect our group, we need rules that are rigged, right, to help us to sort of equalize things. There's a lot of cancel culture in Wyoming right now, politics, I could tell you that for sure, right? Liz Cheney is certainly being canceled all the time, but Republicans there, even very conservative ones, feel like if they just move a little bit to the center on some issue, right? Like if they're against like guns in the ER, they're going to be canceled, right? There's going to be a push to sort of get them out of the party. And even, I love this, the counter movement on the more moderate establishment right in Wyoming started a group that looks a lot like the groups that have countered wokeism in the academy. So this group, they call themselves Frontier Republicans. They're pushing back against this sort of MAGA right, which is very purist in its orientation. And if you go to their website, they want viewpoint diversity and civil discourse, right? It looks exactly like Heterodox Academy and all of the sort of organizations that are pushing to really trying to keep the university open. So I guess going back to Gail's question, right, if this really comes from French critical theory, why does so much of why do we see so much of this on the right? And why do we see it so deeply embedded in our own, I think, history? So anyway, I'm skeptical.
So two things here.
Yes.
One, to the audience, if you've got a question, please fill out a card. But I want to pitch an alternative theory to the three of you. Not so much for what's happening on campus, though partly, but what's happening in American corporations now that have become very politically attuned, shall we say, to everything. In 1991, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1991. And one of the things that it did that didn't get all that much publicity at the time was that it made money damages available for the first time, that is, damages for emotional distress and punitive damages for a Title VII violation. And that included harassment causes of action. Sexual harassment was the biggest thing at the time, but racial harassment, it all fits under Title VII. For the first time, an employer might have to pay punitive damages or damages for emotional distress for an employee who says, I was harassed, I was upset by things that were said. And suddenly, every employer in the country is thinking, oh, I got to be careful here because the definition of what constitutes harassment is really very vague, and importantly, it's cumulative. So every little thing that might be regarded as rude can add up, even though 6 different people say 6 different things. If it all adds up to, well, that's enough to be harassment, then the employer can be held liable. And suddenly all these employers start worrying about litigation, and they bring in trainers to say, don't say this and don't say that, and be very careful about saying anything like this. And people have gotten used to that over time. You know, everybody who has a job, I get trained like several times a year on what not to say. And I think that's true for a whole generation now, or 30 years of this. It's become a billion-dollar business. I think that's a very large contributing factor to why we see what otherwise you might think of as just leakage out of campuses. Ideas matter, but so does fear of litigation. circumstances matter, the law matters, that you know, it's true that, you know, that culture affects politics, but politics in the form of law affects culture as well. So, like, what do you think of that? Am I crazy?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's certainly part of the context that is, you know, affecting both our universities and big companies as well. I guess I would also just add just the importance of smartphones. You know, obviously that's a major factor here, and people being, you know, scared of social media.
I mean, it makes sense that that would have an impact, but that was 1991, and there's really just been a surge of this in the last 5 years that's really gotten big. So that could be part of it, but I think a lot of it has to do with the political moment we're in as well.
Yeah, well, my point is simply over time,
Right.
culture gets to this. But
It trickles, but like it's Niagara Falls right now, and like things are getting crazy.
I got a lot of questions here for you.
Oh boy.
Okay, first one for Cassie. Which institutions and/or avenues do you have hope for fostering for free speech in today's world?
That's a good one. I wish I had hope in specific institutions, but I think I have hope in people, and that's such a non-conservative thing to say. But I think what Elon Musk is doing with Twitter, whether the deal goes through or not, serves as an example that people do want to have open discourse. So many people came back onto the platform when he made that announcement. Me, just myself, in 1 week I gained 20,000 followers without tweeting anything significant because so many people came back to the platform. So I think that was really important. I don't know, I'm just a pessimist all around, but I think if people keep speaking up and pushing back and just getting sick of politics. I think so many people on both sides are just sick of politics, and they don't want to be around people who are hyper political, because it's just turning people out. People are still burnt out from the election. So I think if we just depoliticize for a little bit and take it down a notch, things could improve across the board.
I think this one is for John. Tocqueville spoke of intermediary institutions, education, law, family, etc., and their necessity for tempering populism and tyranny for a democracy. Is institution building anti-Tocquevillian, or would Tocqueville have us merely preserve the institutions we already have?
Well, I mean, is this feels like a question about the University of Austin or something? Like should we make new institutions? No, I think it's great. I mean, I wish the University of Austin all the success in the world, but we have thousands of colleges and universities in this country. I think some are in. But there's a huge range. I mean, they vary a lot. I mean, I think that's important to remember. I mean, so Cassie went to a women's college. Women's colleges are famously terrible. You could see this in the FIRE data. You know, I think there's some of the most repressive, particularly the small, like liberal arts colleges, are particularly bad. But there's a big spectrum there. It's a big country. Universities and colleges, I think, is one of the great achievements of American civilization. And I think the idea that somehow you can just make tons of parallel institution is sort of is sort of crazy. But I also think that there's the institutions that exist are much healthier than I think the worst cases suggest, right? And that's what we see filtered through our media too.
Well, I think also if you look at our most prestigious institutions in America, they're also the source of the problem. I mean, Harvard, Yale, all of them should be leading the way and setting the example for the other institutions, and they're just not doing it. They're pushing out professors. They're shouting down speakers. Their students are, especially in the anti-Israel movement, they're really shutting down people there. So I think, even if I was citing UMass Amherst, that's one of the biggest public institutions in America, and they're very guilty of pushing down free speech.
Yeah, but I guess the question is sort of, one, I think it's very domain specific. Again, I think it's particular issues that students feel like they've got to dance around. I think that's important to keep in mind. But I also sort of wonder, again, what is it like inside the typical classroom at a Harvard or Princeton? Maybe we should ask Rob. I mean, but it's sort of hard to know, right? Because classrooms are sort of closed spaces. We don't get to see them. And what we see is sort of stuff on the surface. I mean, for example, when I think about my own college, we had a big dust-up over Heather MacDonald. It was a big scandal. If that's all you knew about the college, you'd think, oh, gee, this is a very repressive, intolerant institution. But I have to say it's not, right? Like, you get an amazing, excellent education there. And so I think that sometimes the culture wars, as they're fought out over occasional, again, conflicts over speakers, et cetera, distort a much more encouraging reality sort of on the ground. I suspect your average Harvard classroom I expect you get an excellent education at Harvard or Princeton or Yale.
Yeah, but the statistics right now, 66% of Americans say that it's okay to shut down a speaker. 23% say it's okay to use violence to shut down a speaker. So as we can have hope for what's going on in the classrooms, I think it's important to talk about the things that aren't going well and try to counter those.
I completely agree. So in fact, I mean, right, and I'm actually concerned about my colleagues who don't take the problem seriously, right? So I feel like on the one hand, I'm worried about my colleagues who have their head in the sand, but on the other, against some on the right who want to make the case that the sort of sky is falling, we just need new institutions, the university's broken. Again, I think it really echoes the sort of pessimism of the left right now that I think is just not I mean, yes, it's a serious problem, but it's not a catastrophe either, right? Like the university, again, I think, where else do Americans get rich exposure to all kinds of views that aren't their own? I still think that's in the university.
But John,
right?
No.
No. Okay.
I mean,
you can disagree.
I mean, UVA is, classically, a fairly moderate, as you know. I mean, you've got your PhD there, place where there were, a decent number of conservative faculty, but they're fewer and fewer in number, and the vast majority of faculty, and certainly our administrators,
the administrators are another story.
Are extremely progressive. We're always getting missives about this issue and that issue from our administrators. So the signals are being sent. Mm-hmm. And what's happening at UVA, for instance, is that when I was an undergraduate there in the late 80s and early 90s, I lived on the lawn, which is sort of the place where the student leaders live at UVA. And most of the students on the lawn at that point in time kind of leaned left, but there were conservatives on the lawn, and no one was particularly, ideological. It was very cordial. But what we're seeing now is that the elite students at UVA are much more likely to kind of take an extremely progressive position on a variety of issues, and to be pretty hostile towards the First Amendment. So we had a little mini kind of conference call with alumni and faculty and student leaders at UVA in the last year and a half. And the student leaders were the most skeptical of the sort of merits of the First Amendment, most likely to use, language about, safety and, sort of the harms that free speech, offered. So I'm just saying there's something happening on our college campuses that is, is pushing things in a very progressive direction. And there is no effort on the part of most university presidents and deans and chairs to foster a culture of intellectual diversity. And so it's profoundly broken in that sense. I mean, so it doesn't come close to representing kind of the broad swath of American attitudes about politics and culture and religion in the average. So, I mean, you could talk about what's going on in the classroom, but I'm just saying we have to acknowledge that the vast majority of professors in most universities and colleges across this land are clearly to the left. So at least,
question.
So
no
that's a problem.
Let me add something to this.
I'm not disagreeing with it as a problem, right? I feel like we're sort of talking.
Let me add an extra question here that I think may help a little bit. To what extent has the explosion of administrators versus faculty caused the policing of speech and ideas to increase? What role do administrators play in all of this?
Can I start with that one? Sure. So one of the first things I want to say is I'm not in favor of burning down the institutions necessarily.
There it is.
But I am in favor of punishing them. I'm in favor of not donating to them. I'm in favor of not attending them. The reason why I picked SPP was because I knew I would not have a professor here who would refuse to have me in their class, which happened to me at Mount Holyoke. I knew that I would get an education and be around people who are okay with me having opinions that might be different than theirs. So I don't think you need to burn them down, but they do need to have some punishment. And that includes people who maybe do donate and are writing letters and being very explicit about what they think. So not only taking away money, but being expressive about that. Not only not sending your kids there, but being expressive about that. Saying these things, pushing back, making a fuss. When it comes to professors, I just want to give some statistics so we can talk about it. 1 in 6 professors identify as conservative, and that was from 2015, so who knows what it is now. 1 in 28 in New England are conservative, which is where I'm from, so that's not great. And 60% of faculty in a 2018 survey say that they are liberal or far left, and only 12% are conservative. So there definitely is a problem. And for the administrators, I always had more trouble with the administrators than I did professors at all in my college. The administrators are terrified. They're terrified of controversy from liberals and from conservatives. They were very delicate with me once I started writing and gating a big online platform. Once I started going on Fox News and talking about how horrible they were very nice to me. Even though I don't hear from them anymore at all. I don't get invited to anything. But they're afraid of controversy, and that's the problem there. Universities don't want to have controversial discussions anymore. They just want to play it safe on both sides.
Anybody else on administrators? Because it has been my experience that it's the administrators who are number one concerned about sort of federal law compliance. They're the ones that are worrying about litigation, and also they're more consumer oriented. We want to please the students, and that also contributes to the illiberalism of modern campuses. But here is another question. What is being done to study and counteract illiberal ideology in elite K through 12 schools that seem to have become very common, unfortunately? What is being done there?
Well,
Very little.
yeah, I mean, there are, I mean, efforts, in the ed reform space, the Fordham Foundation, for instance, would be one, or, one example. I mean, there are a variety of ed reform groups that are working on that issue. But I think, again, this kind of brings me back to my more pessimistic take than John. I mean, I think our ed schools are often, the most problematic, institutions. And that's deeply worrisome because they're shaping the teachers who are, in turn, educating the 90% of American kids who are in public schools, So again, I think, I'm enough of a Burkean to appreciate we can't kind of go to zero here, right? But I think we have to think very creatively, given where we sit in this culture today, about how do we really reform higher education in a profound way, so that we can steer the culture in a better direction than it's currently heading. And one of the biggest problems is our ed schools.
Yeah, I would comment that even Burke wasn't all that Burkean. At any rate, ladies and gentlemen, I think we have reached the top of the hour here. And so I would ask you to join me in giving our panelists a hand.